Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sit Heads Meditation Club. My name is John. I help organize this group. And Sit Heads is a sitting and social group for people interested in deep meditation practice or even just curious about deep meditation practice. Everything we do is free and donation based. And if you want to hang out with us, you can find us at sit-heads.com. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Patrick Kearney. Uh, Patrick, is it okay if I talk about you a little bit in the third person while you sort of sit there and
You
take
may.
it?
I'll
All
just
right,
absorb into not self and not be bothered.
there you go. Perfect. So, Patrick Kearney is a meditation teacher. He has practiced the Satipatthana Vipassana style of mindfulness meditation, most frequently found in Burma, since 1977. His training is mostly in the tradition of the very famous Burmese, 20th century Burmese master, 19th century? 20th century, I think, uh, Mahasi Sayadaw. And he also spent several years as a Buddhist monk. His main teachers, I don't think he actually got to intersect with Mahasi himself, but his main teachers were Mahasi's very, very famous heir and Dharma heir and lineage holder Sayadaw U Pandita, as well as John Hale. He also trained in the Diamond Sangha lineage of Zen, where his teachers were Robert Aitken Roshi and Paul Maloney Roshi. So Patrick has been teaching full time for over 20 years. He teaches both practical techniques as well as the underlying theory. And to me, I have never met a dual Mahasi style Vipassana Zen practitioner. That is a very fascinating juxtaposition for me. So I am very excited to get to talk to Patrick about it. Patrick, I'm really happy that you're here with us. Before you and I have a conversation and then open it up to Q&A, is there anything that you want to say before we get started?
No, I think you covered the essential points.
All right.
I think we can get started.
Cool. So we'll just have a little chat, you and I, maybe
Yep.
30 minutes, something like that, maybe a little longer if I can't restrain myself. And then we will open it up to Q&A from the group. So we had a nice chat before, Patrick, and
Yeah.
every time I chat with one of our guests in advance and we have a really good chat, I'm always like, oh no, I used it up. I like, you know what I mean? I like used up the one really good, organic, fluent, engaging, interesting chat, and now I'm gonna be like a boring uh, plank of wood or something for the actual conversation. But I'll try. That doesn't have to be a self fulfilling prophecy. Um, the place where I want to start is exactly where I said. Mahasi Vipassana, for anyone who doesn't know, that is, people may be familiar with it as noting, which I think is a slightly reductive way of referring to it, but I think that that's what people are familiar with. Oh, noting practice. Um, but we could talk about the ways in which it's more than noting. That would be interesting. But first, I just want to ask, like, Mahasi style Vipassana from Burma, Zen practice from Japan originally. Um, what? Huh? How'd that
Uh,
happen?
well, it happened organically, as it were, by accident. Um, I got involved in Zen in the late 70s in Sydney when I bumped into, I was looking for people to meditate with, and there was very, very little happening
And did
in
you
Sydney.
already know how to meditate? Had you learned somewhere?
I'd begun. Earlier in the year, I'd left Australia to go to Sri Lanka in India because there was no. This is in the early mid 70s. I was reading about Buddhism, reading about meditation. Decided I've got to do this, but there was nothing happening in Australia. So I went to Sri Lanka in India. I did a retreat in Sri Lanka 2 weeks at Kanda Meditation Center. That was my first jump in. It was quite horrific.
And what was the lineage and what was the style of practice?
Well, theoretically, it was Mahasi, but in fact, as I realized later on, the monk who was in charge of the center at that time was not only not Mahasi, but actually anti-Mahasi.
Huh.
So what I was actually practicing was essentially serenity with Anapanasati here, the nose tip.
Okay.
But I
Interesting.
didn't know enough about what was going on to realize that was what was going on.
Uh-huh. And they were telling you, they were like, oh, this is the practice in the tradition of Mahasi Sayadaw, and then they
No,
proceeded
no,
to
no,
something
no,
else?
nobody mentioned it.
Okay.
But I did talk about that I was having problems with the focusing here because I was getting a lot of head tension and so
Yeah.
on. And I suggested that I bring the awareness down below to the rising and falling of the abdomen because I had read about this. And the teacher was horrified. Oh, no, he said, you can't do that. You cannot focus on your bowels. Your bowels are dirty. You focus here. And I was thinking, you don't
At
think
this
this is
very
dirty?
clean part.
Yes, apparently.
Okay. All right.
And that was when I realized there was something odd going on. But anyway, I stayed there 2 weeks, but my body was in terrible shape. My knees hurt for 2 weeks afterwards. I had to sit leaning against a wall. That's when I realized I've got to do yoga, chiropractic, massage, just to
Mm.
physically be able to do it. Went off to India, got sick, got hepatitis, came back, and decided I've got to be better prepared next time. So I was looking in Sydney for someone to meditate with, and I just came across um, an announcement about a visiting Tibetan Lama who was giving a talk. Went to the talk, put my name down for the mailing list. He ran a weekend retreat, and at that weekend retreat, I was sitting hunched over on this terrible cushion, and I looked to my right, and there on the floor was this magnificent black cushion. And I looked at that cushion and I thought, I've got to get a cushion like that. And then my eyes went upwards to the fellow sitting on it, full lotus, perfectly straight back, perfect mudra. And I thought, I've got to get a posture like that. And that was Lee Davison, who was one of the founders of Zen in Australia. So I joined what was then the Sydney Zen group, but what is now the Sydney Zen Centre. So I was one of the very early members by coincidence. But I liked it because they had good cushions. They taught you how to sit, the posture, and they only sat for 25 minutes at a stretch. And I could handle that.
What else could you want?
What else could you want? And they
Uh,
told me to keep my eyes open, which I found excellent advice because that way I didn't fall asleep.
did you end up with do you sit in perfect full lotus now?
I've never made it to full lotus,
Mhm.
but except for a few moments at a time. But I do sit comfortably now.
I hurt my knees quite badly trying to sit in full lotus early on in my
Uh,
meditation practice and attempt
It's it,
to an attempt to like be a big shot. It's
yeah.
important that I sit in the most meditative way. So I would sit for an
It,
hour at a time in full lotus, but I also didn't open my hips or stretch or do anything. So just not great on the knees.
no, it's interesting the number of long-term meditators who have injured their kneecaps
Yeah.
because it's the problem is not the knees. The problem is, as you point out, the hips. If you don't have
Hips.
the hip flexibility, all the stress goes to the kneecap.
Yeah,
And if you're raised sitting on furniture, you don't have the hip flexibility unless you're
for
very,
sure.
very unusual.
But
So
okay,
you got to
so you
work
found
a
your
lot
way
on the
to
hips.
Zen. You
Yep,
did a little bit of what was purportedly Mahasi, but was not.
yep.
Then you found your way to Zen, and
And
you eventually you stayed there for a bit.
well, we ran the first Zen retreat in Australia. We at the time we were writing to every Zen teacher we had heard of, saying, "Why don't you come to Australia?" And that basically they never even bothered to answer. And then finally we wrote to Robert Aiken Roshi in Hawaii and said, "Why don't you come to Australia?" And he answered. It was fantastic. I remember the meeting, we're all sitting around saying, "We've got a letter from a Zen teacher." It's unbelievable. Anyway, in the letter he said, "No, but why don't you ask my teacher Yamada Roshi?" So we wrote to him in Japan, and he wrote back, and he said, "No, why don't you ask Aiken Roshi?" So they were just bouncing us between. And at that point, we got fed up and we just organized our own retreat. And when Aiken Roshi found out about this, he was horrified and he said, I'm coming.
You
So
called his
that's
bluff.
that's what brought him there. So we established this connection with the Diamond Sangha in Hawaii. So when I had the money to once more head off on pilgrimage, I started in Hawaii. And I went there originally to stay for 3 months, but I ended up staying 2 years. And if any of you have spent time in Hawaii, you would understand exactly why.
Huh.
It's a very difficult place to leave. In fact, when I left, my motive was, if I don't leave now, I'll never leave.
Yeah.
So then I went back to Southeast Asia and South Asia. And at that time, this is 1982, and the Burmese government had shut down the foreign meditation program. And you could only get a 1-week tourist visa to Burma. That was it. So I headed off to Sri Lanka and India again, and only made it to Burma in 1984 on the 1-week visa. And in Calcutta, before I went there, I met someone who was coming from the other direction. I'd just been in Burma, landed in Calcutta, and I said, so what's happening at Mahasi Center? And he said, well, there's a new bloke who's teaching the foreigners. His name is Upandita. And I said, what's he like? And he shook his head and he said, I never realized just how sloppy my meditation was until I worked with Upandita.
Yeah.
And I thought, I've got to go there.
Yeah, the perfect straight as a pin, lotus posture, gotta go to the Zen guy. I'm seeing a pattern, right? Like
Yeah,
love
maybe there is
for
a pattern.
sort of rigor, I guess.
So I went there and I spent a week with him. And he was very busy because he was running the center. And he had only 1 hour a day to teach the foreigners. And there was one foreigner. That was me. So I had an hour a day with him.
Wow, and so your teacher, it wasn't one of his more junior sayadaws. It was directly with Upandita himself.
He had just taken over the job of teaching the foreigners.
On a daily basis, you interviewed with him.
Well, yeah, but of course there were no foreigners. Later on, when he became popular and lots of people came, he stepped back and he had other people do the interviews.
Yes.
But in those early years, he was doing the interviews.
Wow.
And partly, I think, for his own education, to find out, what was going on with these people. Who are they?
And how long were you at?
We're much more difficult to teach than the Burmese.
This was at Mahasi Sasana Yekta?
Mahasi Center. Yeah, Mahasi Sasana Yekta. It was only afterwards that he left and set up his own center.
Sure.
So at the end of my week, I went to say goodbye, and he said, you should go to the office and apply for long-term meditation visa. And I said, but Sayadaw, there are no long-term meditation visas. You can only get a tourist visa. And he replied, you should go to the office and apply for a long-term meditation visa. And I said, yes, Sayadaw. So I went off there, and the government had just opened up. So I applied for got the sponsorship, went to Bangkok, applied for the visa, and eventually got it and came back for 3 months with him. That was, I was the first one back after that closure period.
Wow.
And about 24 hours after I arrived, another foreigner turned up. And this is an English guy called John Hale, who I'd met briefly in India previously. And I realized that there was something special about him because we went off to our first meeting with Upandita. We're sitting in the room that I'd been in before, and I was looking around. Wow, this is nice to come back again. And I glanced at John, and he was already in deep samadhi. And I thought, uh-oh, this guy's pretty good. And he was phenomenal. And so really that 3-month retreat, I had 2 teachers, Sayadaw and John. And I got to know John. We became friends. He became my main teacher eventually. Yeah. So that was the Mahasi connection. And meanwhile, eventually, when I came back to Australia, and one of my old Zen friends said, "Well, now you can come back to Zen." I said, "No, I'm not really not interested. Not interested." But I foolishly said, "But I would like to actually figure out the Mu koan because I've been working on the Mu koan, Zhao Zhou's Mu, and I'd never got it."
And just to briefly, just for anyone who doesn't know, the koan you're referring to this sort of, um, I mean, how would you briefly describe a koan? We've had Joan Sutherland with us as well, so we've talked about koans, but not everyone's necessarily seen that talk. Could you
It's
briefly give us like the capsule one sentence? What's a koan and what's mu?
a koan is
MU, by the way, not MOO, like a cat.
mm, a koan is essentially a story. It can be very brief or much longer, but it encapsulates a Dharma understanding which cannot be conveyed conceptually,
Mm.
which you have to either get or you don't get it, as the case may be. And one of the classical opening koans, the koans that open you up into the whole system, is Zhao Zhou's Mu. And the story goes, a monk asked Zhao Zhou, does a dog have Buddha nature or not? Zhao Zhou said, Mu. And Mu, apparently, medieval Chinese and in Sino-Japanese, is the negative. So no or not.
Yeah, I
It's
never fully understand why they don't just call it the no koan if that's actually a word.
well, I think my personal hypothesis is it's not as mysterious and mystical if you say no.
No, it's not mu. It
It's much
isn't.
more impressive if you say mu.
I'm gonna
So
start trying that actually, just in my day-to-day
it's very interesting when you try it that way.
conversations.
But no,
Um,
oh
yeah.
no,
Would you like
something
fries with
no.
that? Moo.
Hmm.
Um, but so okay, there's something I'm struck by here. I want to get into the actual talking about meditation and talking about like Mahasi practice and Upandita's approach to it and whether it does or doesn't intersect with Zen in your mind in terms of the nature of the practice. But something that I'm struck by is what it was like to be a a curious and sincere meditator and sort of pursuer of Buddhist practice in the late 1970s and early 80s. It's so different. There are people watching this, not right now as you and I speak, but literally this is being consumed as a YouTube video sometime in the future, and some future person is watching this, and they just went onto their computer and just typed meditation, and they have access to all these teachers, all these teachings, all the different styles of practice. It's uh it's an embarrassment of riches now. But back then, you wanted to learn about meditation, you went to India, you went to Sri Lanka. Um, and then when you came back to Australia, you got into Zen, it sounds like, kind of because that's what was around. Because there
Hmm.
wasn't like a full menu, like a smorgasbord of everything that you could want the way that there is now. And I've talked about this with some other teachers who are closer to your generation than to mine. It just feels like it was such an adventure then. It was
Hmm.
hard and you had to really work, you had to travel, you had to spend money, you had to spend time, you had to endure hardships to obtain the Dharma.
Hmm.
Um, and in some ways, that sucks. But in other ways, what an adventure. And what a feeling of, in some way, having earned it, right? Having had to climb the proverbial mountain to meet the master on top instead of just putting it into your Google search bar. And it also seems like there's a camaraderie among the people who were fellow travelers from that generation. It sounds like you and John Hale had an experience of being sort of bound together by that shared odyssey that you went on. I know that Sharon and Joseph and Jack. I haven't met Jack, but I know that there was that feeling among them and Mirabai Bush and all these people. What does it feel like to look? One, is that true? Am I looking at things through rose-tinted lenses? This sort of nostalgia for a past I didn't get to experience, or was it really like that? And how does it feel to look out over the landscape as it is today, where things are so different in terms of how one accesses Dharma?
I think if you look at the current situation from my perspective, Dharma is much more widely spread, inconceivably so compared to my youth. But I mean, when I started meditating, To actually be interested in doing Buddhist meditation, much less to actually pursue it and do it, you had to be certifiably insane. It's just a completely crazy thing to do. Now it's all over the place in the guise of mindfulness. It's become part of the culture.
Yes.
So the Dharma culture these days is very, very wide, but it's very shallow.
Mm.
Back in the day, it was very narrow, but it went very deep.
Sort of spread thin in a
Yeah.
way.
But I think this is inevitable. I think this is just part of the way the Dharma spreads into a new culture. And it'll deepen over time because there's always some people who want to go, who have to go deep, and they'll find a way, regardless of the circumstances.
Mm.
And they're the point of the spear. They're the ones who push it forward. But one thing that is different is economically, it's much harder these days. When I left, when I saved money in Australia to go to Asia, well, back when I arrived in Hawaii in 1980, $1 Australian was worth, I think, $1.20 American. It's now about maybe 70 cents American. Plus, there was full employment. So you could walk away from a job and disappear for a year, 2 years, 5 years, and come back feeling confident you can just walk into another job.
That's incredible.
But young people today, it's like they feel if I don't grab that next rung on the ladder right now, I'm done. I'm finished.
Yeah.
You didn't have that sense of insecurity. Capitalism was not as developed and as ruthless then as it was now. So it was economically and socially a lot easier for people to do this. Now you've got to have, I think, double, triple the dedication to do that because when you walk away, you've got absolutely no idea will you ever be able to get back in again.
Yeah, that door might close behind you.
Yeah.
You
And
know,
there was always a problem, but back in the day, it was nothing like as bad as it is today.
I think, I mean, this is one of the reasons I think that, excuse me, this is one of the reasons I think that when uh, Sharon and Joseph and Jack came back, the thing they started was a retreat center
Mm.
because that was the paradigm they understood and it was an accessible paradigm. The idea that, well, if someone's really serious about practice here in the West, they'll find a way to do a 3-month retreat every year or something like that. And that was kind of viable, it sounds like, in a way that it isn't so much now. And that's why I feel like there's a need for, I mean, it's part of what we're trying to do with Sit Heads is a different kind of institution, an institution that doesn't require you to fully uproot yourself from your life in a way that isn't as doable as it was maybe in the 70s, and still find your way to deep practice somehow. But
Yeah.
it is interesting how that paradigm really, the IMS paradigm really still is the way it's set up, what it's set up to support is sporadic, long retreats.
Mm.
Um,
And that's necessary if
yes.
you want to go deep. If you've got to spend the time to go deep, and depending on how disturbed the mind is, and the contemporary Western mind is a lot more disturbed than, say, the Burmese mind of the 1980s. And it takes us a lot longer just to settle.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also, we're burdened by the fact that we don't have saddha, we don't have faith.
Oh, true. Yeah. You said Saddha, the spiritual faculty. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, it's amazing how uh, our our sort of rationalistic skepticism is so useful in so many things and such an incredible obstruction during meditation practice. Um, and I remember when I first started doing Vipassana practice, Mahasi style practice, and I learned about the sort of 5 controlling faculties, the 5 spiritual faculties that you use in Vipassana practice, one of them being saddha or faith. Um, that one I sort of poo-pooed. I didn't say anything to my teacher, but I was like, okay, well, that one I don't care about. I'll focus on the other ones. That's like
Mm.
that's some vestigial thing left in from a more benighted era. And I was so crazily wrong. I mean, once I was able to understand that faculty as something akin to trust rather than as I had grown up understanding faith, meaning sort of blind faith in something that you have no evidence for. Once I understood it to mean a sort of trust that is engendered by experience, I was able to connect with that faculty a bit more and see its essentiality, really.
Yes, we're in the West, we're hampered by our cultural conditioning,
Yeah.
which sees faith as essentially belief, but in particular, belief in things that normal, rational people would not believe in.
Mm.
And on the other side is science, and science is all about rationality and empiricism, what actually works, and they're at war with each other. But this is a European cultural war. It's got nothing to do with India. It's got nothing to do with the Buddha, but we drag him into it. But Saddha, I mean, there's no real adequate translation for it. It comes from the Sanskrit word shrad, heart, and the root da, to place. So sad in Pali, da, to place the heart, as in to put one's heart into something, or to place in the heart, to take something to heart. So saddha is all about the heart relationship to what's going on. So it's rather like love. Like, let's say if you fall in love with someone and then you decide, I want to spend the rest of my life with this person. And if a friend says, look, you are being utterly irrational, what is your evidence that this is going to work out over the next 30 years? What data do you have that could possibly justify this decision? And the answer is, of course, there isn't any. But I just know. And I'm going to take the jump because I have to. That's saddha. And it's not belief, it's the heart's movement, the heart's determination to take the chance.
Yeah, beautifully put. Maybe we could use that as a segue into talking about meditation itself. Could you, I'd be curious to hear if you were to describe Mahasi style practice. I feel like Mahasi practice is is maybe not always so clearly understood. There's so many different people talking about it in different ways. It's been filtered through the lenses of various teachers, both older and more contemporary, Asian and Western. And I'm curious if you were to sort of just describe it, someone's never heard of it. What is Mahasi practice? What's it for? Why do I do it? And how do I do it? How would you
The
explain
practice,
it?
the practice essentially is to directly aware whatever is happening now. That's the practice.
All right, so I'm this hypothetical person who's never heard of it. I would perhaps respond back, yeah, I hear a lot of meditation described that way. Be here now, experience what's happening without judgment. But that doesn't give me that much purchase into what is distinct about this style of practice.
And that's what I liked. That's what I liked about the Mahasi approach, particularly when I came across it through U Pandita. The reason why I left Zen and went back to Asia, when I told my Robert Aiken Roshi, he was horrified that I was descending into the Hinayana. And I told him, I need to go because I want to learn how to meditate. Now, some people are natural and intuitive meditators. They just get it and they just do it. In Diamond Sangha Zen, which is the lineage I trained in, they didn't really teach how to meditate. It was very basic. Just, here's your meditation object, hang on to it. That's it. That was the instruction.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't teach the craft.
Yeah.
But I needed to learn the craft. Exactly how do I do it? When this happens, what do I do then? When that happens, what then? And what U Pandita taught was the craft.
Yeah.
And so you build the craft. how do I directly aware?
Yeah.
What is it that I'm directly awareing? How do I know that I'm directly awareing it? And why should I directly aware it? And what happens when it changes? What happens when it doesn't change? What happens when I'm distracted? And so on. So what Mahasi does is it builds, when it's taught properly, it develops the craft so
Hmm.
that people literally know what they're doing. So these days, I have a number of quite senior Zen people who come to my retreats because they want to learn the craft, because they've never actually learned it.
Yeah. But there are different crafts, right? So like if you learned your craft from S.N. Goenka, your style
Hmm,
of experiencing what's happening in the present moment would look quite different from if you'd learned it from U Pandita.
that's
And
right.
if you managed to glean some insight into what Zen sitting or Shikantaza just sitting is, and you manage to actually learn how to do that, um, that craft is very different as well. It's not like the people who manage to penetrate the heart of Shikantaza are now doing something quite similar to Mahasi, right? It's a different
Hmm.
practice. So
As soon as you go into the whole question of method,
yeah.
technique,
Hmm.
then things start to separate.
Yeah.
Like just in the most general sense, if you've got a room full of people who are starting to learn how to meditate, well, roughly speaking, you could say what you should do is take X as your meditation object. Let's call it the breathing. We could even be more specific. The breathing sensed at the nose tip, the breathing sensed in the abdomen. Stay with that, hang on to it, don't let go. And then when you're distracted, we'll talk about what happens then. That's one possibility. Another possibility is just sit there and let your awareness roam and just notice your awareness. You're always aware. Right now, you are aware. Start to notice the awareness itself. It doesn't matter what you aware. So you've got two ends of a spectrum here. One is where you give yourself something very specific to be aware of, and that's your central point of interest. And the other end, you don't care what you're aware of, you're just interested in the awareness itself. Now, you try that with a room full of people. You'll find some people, if you say just be aware of the awareness itself, they're completely lost. They've got no idea what you're talking about. They're all over the shop. Whereas you give them a specific something to be aware of, at least I know what to do. And they can get started. But other people, you give them that one thing to be aware of, they feel cramped, claustrophobic, tight, they work themselves up. It doesn't work. You say, no, just relax and open up and be aware. Now I'm now I'm present. Now it's really working for me. In other words, people are different. No technique works for everyone. There is no such thing as the one true technique. And this is really, really important, especially for people who are coming into the meditation. There is no one true technique which works for everyone. And it's up to the meditator to discover which method works for me.
Mm.
It's not up to the teacher. The teacher knows what the teacher's been trained in and what the teacher is skillful at. It's up to the meditator to say, no, this doesn't work for me. I've got to try something else.
But that's
Or,
a that's sort of a relatively recent luxury, right? If you were born in 1928 in Burma, you're going to be doing Mahasi practice probably, or maybe Paul. There are a
no,
couple. Actually, there are more options than that in
there are
Burma. That's not fair. You
dozens
could
of,
do
there
there.
were,
You could do
there were,
Mogok Sayadaw and Pa Auk Say. There's a lot. So bad
there's,
example. Forget it.
there's
But
dozens of
but at
insight
least
meditation techniques alone.
it's gonna be one of the Burmese styles because
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
in Burma and it's
yeah,
1933 or whatever,
yeah.
right? And
And
so you better
if,
hope that
if,
one of those
if,
Burmese styles lines up well with you.
and if you're in the US of A, then you're stuck with the American methods. What to do?
What are those? Just
We're
like
all captured by our historical circumstances. We have
yeah.
a particular inheritance, karmic inheritance, genetic inheritance. We're living in a certain time, a certain place. We have certain cultural conditioning. And all of this influences our approach to meditation, what we think meditation is, what we're looking for, how we can do it,
Yeah.
how we're prepared to learn it, what teachers are available to teach us. Everything is conditioned.
But all I was saying is that the idea that you said of if this technique doesn't work for you, try another, find the one that
Mm,
works for you. It's only relatively recent that you would have access to more than a few options in
yeah.
terms of what technique, right? Like you ended up doing Zen because what you've been doing before wasn't around, right?
Mm.
And so it's actually quite a blessing that
Yeah.
you can
And
test these things. Yeah.
that's the big advantage of the current situation, where, as I said, very wide. Now, shallow, what to do, but it's the person who brings the depth into it.
Mm.
But you've got lots of options to explore, and lots of choices. And so you've got the potential to find something that actually works for you. But of course, once you find it, you go for it. You
Yeah.
don't, you can't afford to muck around.
Would you say that despite your long time involvement with Zen, would you say that when it comes to your technique or to your craft, that you are primarily a sort of Mahasian? Like that's are you doing Zen style shikantaza, or would you say that your technique is mostly influenced by the Burmese practice?
The deeper you go in any technique, the more you actually, to some degree, master it, the more the practice itself turns into play.
Mm.
And when you meet someone else who's playing, you can recognize the similarities. So a lot of these differences, they're very, very important when you begin, but they're not so important later on. So Shikantaza, Mahasi style, I think they come together.
You do.
Oh
Interesting.
yeah. Fundamentally, they turn out to be the same thing. But you've got to get there. How do you get there? You've got to go along a certain path. So the different techniques or the different lineages provide different paths. And the different paths suit particular kinds of people. And if they work, they'll get you there. But once you're there, you can look around and you realize, oh yeah, that's similar. I can see
Mm.
where they're coming from.
Yeah.
I can see why they're doing that.
So that's super interesting to me because I've talked with people who have different views on this matter, where some people feel that no, these practices are different and they don't necessarily go to the same place. They have things in common. You'll recognize things in the other practices. And you'll see the similarities, but they're taking you to different places. They take you to different awakenings, different samadhis, and then there are other folks I speak to, and whose work I've read, where they have this conviction that essentially they're all paths to the same mountaintop, and that once you get to the top of the mountain, you'll notice that all those other paths actually get to the very same place. And it sounds like you definitely are someone who feels like these are all pathways up the same mountain. And it's just a question of where you're starting, on what side of the mountain you're starting, and what sort of method of
Mm.
climbing best suits you. Am I sort of characterizing you fairly?
Because what we're dealing with is Dharma. And Dharma is simply what is happening, what is real. That's it. So, of course, there's a similarity because we're all dealing with the same samsara and it's all the same Dharma. There are differences in concept. There are conceptual differences, and these can be very great. So, for example, I'm climbing up the mountain. Well, what is the top of the mountain? It's enlightenment. So, what is enlightenment exactly? Well, if you go to the classical Theravada and go back to the Buddha himself, it's quite simple. Full enlightenment is the cessation of greed, hatred, and delusion. But you talk to a lot of people in secular Buddhism, you talk to some people in Mahayana Buddhism, they say, no, 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 no. That's ridiculous. That's psychologically impossible. Doesn't exist. So they will define enlightenment in some other way. So, for example, I was reading a book on, I forgot who wrote it, very good American practitioner, academic. Oh, I forget his name. I'm too old. I can't remember names anymore. I was never very good at it anyway. But he wrote a book on enlightenment. I think it might have even been "What is Enlightenment?" ? And so I was very interested. So I read the book, and really it should have been named "What is Enlightenment in Zen?" because he's coming out of a Zen background. And a lot of it was about the problem which arises when a respected Zen teacher goes off the rails and is enmeshed in scandal. So how does one reconcile their enlightenment with their scandal? How do you bring that together? And there was much learned discussion about this. And I'm reading this thinking, it's pretty obvious. If he got into these scandals, mate, he wasn't enlightened. He might have been very charismatic. He might have been a great leader. He might have been very dedicated. But he's obviously not enlightened, because otherwise he wouldn't have got involved in these scandals. It's pretty simple. So you notice the conceptual framework is very different. If you're involved in these kinds of scandals, you are not enlightened. Simple. But versus, no, you can be enlightened, but somehow or other you still get immersed in all these different kinds of scandals.
Right.
Now, this is purely conceptual. And in the world of concept, you can have these divisions and they never go away, because that's the nature of concept.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is one of the difficulties that we face. Whenever we talk about Dharma, we're in the world of concept. It's only in the direct experience that we have the purity of the Dharma itself. And in that direct experience, there is, well, the concept doesn't matter. It's just what's going on.
And you would say something similar with technique, that essentially the technique is just a way of getting you to the truth, just a way of getting you to the Dharma. And so the differences between the techniques will essentially be discarded with the techniques.
Yeah.
At a certain point.
I like to say that meditation is something we do while we're waiting for something else to happen. It keeps us busy.
Yeah. Sounds like something John Lennon once said or wrote or sang.
I have to think of it. So it is.
Yeah. Well, I have monopolized your time long enough. Why don't we open it up to Q&A? Does that sound okay, Patrick?
Yep, sounds good.
Yeah, this was delightful for me. I could do this all night, but no one wants that. So, Frida, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah. Yes, this is Freda. So I have done 3 60-day retreats at Saigon Gong. And I interact mostly with common ground these days. And there's a lot of focusing on the mindfulness of breathing via Analeo, who is rather critical of Mahasi in a talk I heard. Anyway, I'm trying to figure out whether I want to just kind of keep myself in one place, or it's okay to kind of move around between the two. Is that enough of a real question?
Sounds like a very real question. I think overall, I think you should feel free to move around. Once you're established in your practice, sounds like you're an experienced practitioner. So you get a sense of what works for you, and then pursue that. And it can be always very useful to explore, try something alternative, try something different, see if it works, see if it doesn't work. When the more experience you have as a practitioner, the more discernment you develop about whether or not something works for you. So in the popular presentation of mindfulness, for example, they really emphasize non-judgmental awareness. And you can see why they're saying non-judgmental, because if you start to meditate, you get caught up in conceptual ideas of what should be, what it shouldn't be, what's supposed to happen, what's not supposed to happen. You get lost. But as you get more experience in the practice, your discernment, your wisdom faculty starts to develop. And you begin to get a sense of what really does work for me and what does not work for me. And you learn to trust that understanding. Remember that for the Buddha, the direction of the practice is toward increasing independence. So you treat your teachers with respect, but in the relationship between teacher and student, the one in charge is the student. So you take on what is useful and you just drop what is not useful. And you can see for yourself over a period of time what works, what doesn't work. And the basic standard is greed, hatred, and delusion going down, or is it going up? If it's going down, it's working. And so you just trust that. You trust your own judgment, your own decision making. Analayo's criticisms of Mahasi are very interesting because it shows his character as an intellectual.
Yeah.
And when you're an intellectual, and he's very, very intellectual, he's really, really, really good at it, then conceptual frameworks are very important to you. Now, one of the things about concepts is they have very clear borders. And you can distinguish between this and that with great accuracy and precision, which is what Analayo and what all good scholars do, especially when you see scholars of Buddhism. Now, that's great because you get a view, a picture of what's going on, which can be extremely useful for the practitioner. But the question is, in my experience, is this working? So I might be doing a practice in which this great authority says you shouldn't do this practice because it's no good for you, but I'm doing it and it's working for me. So who do I believe? My experience or that theory? Well, if I'm a practitioner, there's no debate. My experience. It's an interesting theory, and maybe I'll keep an eye out. Maybe what he's saying is correct, but if this is working for me, I'm going for it.
Thank you very much, Freda. And thank you, Patrick. Appreciate that. Let's see. Bijan, would you like to come up and ask your question?
Yes. Hi, Patrick. Thanks for doing this. So my question to you is about when did the practice feel like it became real for you? Was it sort of a gradual did it feel like the switch from Zen to the Mahasi style, did it feel like you were getting like meditation was real for you in both of those, or was it more like once you switched to Mahasi, there was an experience or a time on retreat where it was like, okay, this is what I'm going to be doing? I guess it comes back to the faith thing. Like when did the faith in the practice really solidify for you?
I was pretty solid before I encountered Mahasi. I started actually, a very early book on Mahasi method was Nyanaponika Thera's book, The Heart of Buddhist Meditation. And I read that when I was a university student in the early 70s. I didn't understand what I was reading. But as I was reading it, there was absolutely no doubt in my mind, I have to do this. I really have to do this. So that was, in a sense, the beginning. When in my Zen days, I really liked Zen. I liked the way the retreats were structured because you were everything was choreographed. You're completely caught up under total control. So there was nowhere to back out to, which is great for lazy, resistant people like me. And you were taken through this process. And what I would reflect afterwards, what is it that brings me back to these things? Because they're so hard. And I realized that it's when I'm doing intensive meditation that I feel real. Things might be quite painful, but they're real. But when I'm not meditating, it's like there's a layer of stuff that gets in the way, and it's not real. It's not authentic anymore. So I've always had that relationship with meditation. What Mahasi gave me, again, was essentially the method. And what the key point was when I discovered, if you're distracted, your distraction becomes your meditation object. That was a revelation. And that's, if you think about how over the long term, what direction do I travel in my meditation practice? What determines the direction that I'm going in? I would say there's two things. One is what I'm interested in. So if I'm doing a meditation practice which is just as boring as batshit, I'm likely to drop it. But if I find a meditation practice which I find interesting, I'll keep going with it. So that's one factor and one vector. And the other one is what gets in the way? What prevents me from meditating? Why is it that I cannot keep my mind on my meditation object for more than 5.2 nanoseconds? That becomes interesting because that's what I've got to work on. That is my meditation object. And it's a really important meditation object. And of course, sometimes what you find interesting and what gets in the way are actually the same thing, which is, in my case, I'm fascinated by distraction. But I'm fascinated by the fact that my mind will not stay still. Why not? What's it doing? How is it doing it? What's happening when it moves like this? It's endlessly fascinating. So that gives me a deep sense of satisfaction because it's real. It's not artificial. I'm not pretending. Decades ago, in my misspent youth, I did some acting lessons with, I can never pronounce the guy's name, the Russian method, Stanislavski, anyway, the method. And they drew the distinction between acting and acting. When you act, it's real. And the audience can see it. When you're acting, there's a layer of I'm pretending to do this. And it's not real. And the audience picks it up immediately. So the best actors are the ones you look at on the screen and you think, this person's not acting. They're the best. And it's that sense of authenticity that I find in the actual meditation encounter. And when I can feel that, I know I'm doing the right thing.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Nomar, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. My question is just about anger. How do you manage anger before, during, and after practice? Because you have a long experience as a meditator.
One way that Mahasi Sayadaw sums up the practice, he says, you're directly aware whatever is predominant right now. If I'm caught up in anger, anger is predominant, anger becomes my meditation object. Now, it's easy to say, but that's when the craft comes in. How do I do that? If I'm working with emotion, and this is true of any emotion, but let's take the emotion of anger. First of all, never believe the story. You cannot be angry unless you've got a story going on in the mind in which someone did something they should not have done. In other words, you've got a complex story with a set of values built into it, and that set of values is being violated. This is the realm of concept. Do not go there. Drop it. Come back to the body. Bring the awareness into the body. When you're actually doing the meditation practice, use the working assumption, every thought that I think is a lie, including the thought that every thought that I think is a lie. That too is a lie. Do not believe any of them. So what to do? Drop the awareness into the body and then feel, how does the anger present in the body non-conceptually? Sensation. Go to the elemental qualities of the sensation. Firstly, where in the body do you feel anger? Now, if there's anger, there's tension in the body. You cannot be angry if the body is completely relaxed. So there's tension. Where is it? You focus in on that. What's the quality of that sensation? Is it hard? Is it soft? Is it hot? Is it cold? So for me, for example, generally with anger, I find anger to be hard, rough, sharp, energetic. So there's a lot of movement in there. And it can be surging throughout the whole body. What's the feeling turn of it? Is it pleasant or is it painful? I find anger is sometimes pleasant when it gives me a sense of power. Like when I meet that person, I'm going to smash them. Oh. It can be excruciatingly painful when it's associated with powerlessness. So impotent rage is acutely painful. So what's the feeling quality of it? Is it hot or is it cold? So usually I find anger to be hot, but sometimes it's cold. And I think the cold variety is the most dangerous, I suspect. So you're going into the body, the physical sensation and the feeling component, and checking the elemental quality of the experience. You might even ask yourself the question, putting aside the story, how do I know that I'm angry? What's the experience? What does it feel like? Oh, it feels like this. And then you allow yourself to feel that. Now, when you do this, if you've got a lot of energy, if the emotion is really strong, there's a lot of energy, you're not going to be very good at maintaining a nice meditation posture. So forget about it. Just do what the body wants to do. If the body wants to go charging off down the street, let the body go charging off down the street, but feel it. And again, again and again, you'll be sucked into the story. This is what it's about. As soon as you recognize that, drop it, come back into the body. You're not interested in what it's about. You're interested in the direct experience of it. So you go right into the center of it, but without the concept, and let it burn itself out, which it will. And then you see the impermanence of it. And you'll notice that the more time you spend in the story, the more you feed the emotion and the longer you extend it. But the more time you can spend inside the sentient body, the faster it'll burn out because you're not feeding it. And then when you see it disappear, that really weakens your attachment to it. Because you can see, oh, it's not permanent. It's not me. So it's a whole, working with emotion is very, very interesting. But the foundation for it is working with the body, because that's where you find emotion. Emotion comes out of the body, the sentient body, the feeling body. So that's where you focus on, but you never believe the story. It is a lie. And that's, for most people, that's the most difficult part, because we invest all our reality into our stories. That's our habit. And that's to break that habit is a really important part of the meditation practice, especially insight meditation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nomar. Thank you, Patrick. Monica and or Chappelle, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, John. Hey, Patrick.
Hello.
Yeah, good to see you. Thanks for coming
Yeah.
through.
Chappelle.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I think you probably touched on when you were talking to Nomar. But I wanted to ask, what would your guidance be for a lay person if they wanted to develop equanimity in the way the Buddha talks about it, and eventually experiencing nibbana? What would your guidance be for that aspiration?
In the broadly speaking, the insight approach, the emphasis is on mindfulness, where mindfulness is the felt continuity of awareness. So what you want is an approach to meditation which emphasizes maintaining awareness continuously over time. And that's the basic discipline. That's the boot camp training. And basically the idea is that if you maintain awareness continuously over time, the more successful you are at that, first of all, the concentration will naturally follow and equanimity will naturally follow. When the mind is dominated by mindfulness, it's dominated by equanimity. They go together. So you cannot make yourself be equanimous. You can't force it. You either, it's like you either got it or you don't got it. But what you can do is by cultivating the continuity of awareness, you can develop the equanimity. Now you notice that if your awareness is going to be continuous, that means that your meditation method, whatever it is, has got to embrace what we normally call distraction. If you think about, like, I'm going to sit for 30 minutes, and this is one of the characteristics of mindfulness meditation practice. It's not object specific. Let's say if you're doing breathing meditation for 30 minutes. So you sit down and you track your breathing. Now, out of those 30 minutes, how many minutes would you actually be on the breathing? 5, 10, 15, 20 on a good day? So that means that you're actually not spending 30 minutes doing the meditation. You're spending 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15, whatever. Because when you're not on the breathing, you're not doing the meditation. But if you're doing a straight mindfulness meditation, you use as your meditation object whatever is happening. So as soon as you realize, oh, I'm distracted, that experience becomes your meditation object. So mindfulness meditation is not restricted to any particular object. So when we talk about the craft of the practice, often what we're talking about is, how do I recognize that my mind has wandered? And then how do I make that the meditation object? Like, for example, anger, if anger comes up. And the more you can do that, the more the awareness becomes continuous. And then the more equanimity will naturally emerge. Just cause and effect. And when you're working with Dharma, you are working with nature. It's not that if you're a good boy, Buddha will reward you. But it's simply that if you create certain conditions, certain effects will arise. If you maintain continuity of awareness, equanimity will arise. It will just happen. And this is just to add something. When we talked about the problem with thinking, is that when we start to think, we lose our awareness. So for example, have you ever had the experience where you're meditating and the mind slides off into thinking, but you don't notice that it slid off into thinking? And then suddenly you realize, oh, I'm thinking. And you realize, I've been thinking for the past 5 minutes. And I didn't even know that I was thinking for the past 5 minutes. The problem is not the thinking. The problem is losing the awareness of the thinking. So this is where it gets really interesting and really tricky. How can I maintain the continuity of awareness no matter what I'm doing, including thinking? That's really tricky and it's very interesting. And it opens up a whole new world.
Thank you. To clarify, it sounds like, yeah, having like a good pressure cooker of time would be really beneficial, like, just going on retreat. Would you say that a lay person would have, I guess, any hope to gather that kind of momentum of awareness throughout their, daily life, especially a Westerner, or I guess every would you say that like retreat time is required to kind of get to this point of equanimity?
Pretty much.
Pretty much.
You'd have to be extraordinarily talented not to need retreat time. But as possible, the best meditators that I've known over the decades have been lay people. And the most enlightened person I've ever known was a lay person. It's definitely available, but you do have to. It's a serious training, and you do have to commit. You do have to commit yourself to it. But it's like anything else. If you want to be a good quality musician, you've got to put the time in. If you want to be a good quality sports person, you've got to put the time in. If you want to be a good quality meditator, you've got to put the time in. And it's got to be quality time. So you've got to approach the whole project with intelligence. It's not just, hours spent sitting on a cushion. So, but it is available if you do it, because it's natural process. It's natural training. You train well, you'll get the result.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chappelle. Thanks, Patrick. So a couple of questions have been sent to me to ask on behalf of the asker. So first, one of the stories is the story of the self. Could you please comment on daily living with awareness of the lie of that story?
That's an interesting one. For the Buddha, self is a construction project that's never quite finished. And when you get to know, in particular, your distractions in the meditation practice, you can see that often what the distraction consists of is the creation of a self in this situation. So there's different ways in which you can become sensitive to it. One way would be, in any given situation, to drop in the question, do I think this is mine? So an emotion comes up. Is this mine? Because if I think it's mine, that's self. Self appropriates and takes as its own. Self and clinging or attachment in the Buddhist teaching always go together. So if you know anything at all about the Buddhist teaching, you know that clinging and attachment are very bad things indeed, and you should stop right now. Now the question is, what is meant by that? Because obviously the Buddha never said that because he didn't speak English. The term he uses is upadana. And upadana comes from dana, gift, giving. Then you have the prefix a, long a, and that changes the direction. If you give, the direction is out there. Adana is bringing in here, taking. Upa denotes intimacy. So upadana is appropriation, intimate appropriation. I'm taking this as mine. And because it's mine, it's me. And because it's mine, it's really, really important. So for example, I'm sure that all of you have dukkha. But I'm here to tell you that your dukkha is not as important as my dukkha. What makes it important? It's mine. So tuning into this relationship can be very interesting. And it might be just as simple as when you get caught up in something, just drop in the question, is this mine? Question mark. Don't do anything with it, but just let that be there. And what the Buddha would say is, actually, it isn't. It's just natural phenomenon coming and going according to conditions. But if I relate to it as mine, it becomes very, very important indeed. And this is where I'm likely to screw things up. I don't know if that's helpful or not. I think I was just ranting at that point.
I can't speak for the person who asked the question, but I certainly found it helpful. So, there's that. I appreciated it very much. I hope that the questioner did as well. Another question that I was asked to ask, if continuity of awareness brings about equanimity, how do the dukkha jnanas arise? And for anyone who isn't familiar with that term, the dukkha jnanas refers, I think, and you could tell me if I'm mischaracterizing, Patrick, but that refers to certain stages in the sort of fairly well-defined, mapped out stages of insight meditation that one typically goes through, particular stages associated with difficult experience and with they're sometimes referred to as the contemplations or the knowledges of suffering, which I think is what dukkha jnana literally means, knowledge of suffering. So basically, it's the part of meditation, of insight meditation practice, where the practice can actually become kind of unpleasant. Um, am I characterizing that fairly? And do you want to answer the question, which again is, if continuity of awareness brings about equanimity, how do the dukkha jnanas arise?
Yep, that's, I think, a fair summary. Basically, this takes us into the territory of insight, which for the Buddha means insight into the three universal characteristics of anicca, dukkha, anatta. Notice always listed in that order. So anicca, change, impermanence; dukkha, pain, suffering; anatta, not self. Now they're listed in that order because they're listed from gross to subtle, from most obvious to least obvious. And if you think about any kind of meditation technique, which is designed to stimulate insight, what it will do is try to get you to notice change, to see the fact of change. The way Mahasi does it is by bringing your attention to the fact of distraction. So I'm meditating, then I'm distracted. I realize I'm distracted. I come back to meditating. In other words, meditating, change. I see I'm distracted, change. Back to meditation, change, 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 change. So any kind of practice which is designed to generate insight is all about exposing change. Now, according to the theory, and I think it actually works in practice, if you take something like the word anicca, usually translated impermanence, sounds very abstract and kind of, unthreatening. But when you look at the word itself, it's which is the negative, nicca, not nicca. In Sanskrit, nitya. Now, nicca in Pali, nitya in Sanskrit, they mean permanent in the sense of lasting unchanged over time, and therefore they also mean reliable. If something doesn't change, it is reliable. I can depend upon it. So in English, you might have, for example, a perpetual endowment. You've got a nicca, a reliable endowment. You can relax now. It's all taken care of. But what the Buddha is saying is every time you aware something, it becomes clearer and clearer that it is anicca, not nicca, not permanent, not unchanging, unreliable. Sooner or later, it does disappoint. And this is built in. It is a feature, not a bug. When this becomes clear, that's when you enter into the dukkha jnana. So when the awareness is continuous enough to really see change, then at some point, deep within, the chitta, the heart, realizes, wait a minute, if everything that I'm aware changes, that means there's nothing to hold on to. That's the essence of dukkha. And then that segues into not self. Now, equanimity emerges. Equanimity gradually develops throughout this process, but it really matures when not self is the predominant perception. But dukkha is really interesting because it's the hinge. So let's say it's the difference between dukkha and dukkha lakkhana, the universal characteristic of dukkha. Where there is self, dukkha is mine. This is my dukkha. It belongs to me. It is screwing up my life. You seem to be getting away with it. You're okay. What about me? So this is dukkha, which is not the universal characteristic of dukkha. It's dukkha mixed with self. It's my dukkha. But when we actually start to perceive dukkha as not mine, but simply built into nature, that this is the nature of things, then strangely enough, the relationship to it lightens up. It's not mine anymore. It's just, this is the fabric of the universe. It's not, oh my God, I'm sick and eventually I'm going to die. It's, that's right. Every creature that is born dies. It's built into the system. And I'm just traveling through that cycle. And that the relationship there is much lighter. As the best expression of this I came across was in Thailand at Wat Suan Mok, Ajahn Buddhadasa's monastery. He had built this big building, which he called a spiritual theatre. It was like a Dharma museum, lots of exhibits. And he had paintings on the wall. My favorite painting was a very small painting on the wall, and it showed a fat Chinese-style monk doing a Qigong stretch. And he had a big grin on his face. And underneath it was a little poem in Thai. And it translated into English as, "Oh, boundless joy, now I see there is no happiness in this world." It sums up Dukkha.
Buddhadasa, always good for a sort of brain-twisting aphorism, I find.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very good. So this is dukkha mixed with not self.
Mhm.
And then it's a whole different set of, it's a whole different thing. And so one can go through the dukkha jnana, which is literally the understanding jnana of pain, dukkha. But that understanding sees the universality of it. And therefore the sense, it's not about me. It's okay. And from that, compassion arises, universal compassion. It's about samsara. It's about the human condition. And it's okay. And I'm going to do something about it. If I can do something, and I can always do something. So I'm going to do something about it, but I'm not going to be overwhelmed by it. There's no need.
Yeah. And no benefit either.
That's right. And of course, although we talk about this process, like anicca, then dukkha, then anatta, it's actually a non-linear system. If something is anicca, it is also dukkha and anatta. If something is dukkha, it's also anicca and anatta. If something is anatta, it's also dukkha and anicca. They always come together. Now, people sometimes do in their practice experience it according to that system because they're going gradually deeper. But in fact, in practice, people's experiences can be all over the shop. So people can find themselves in particular jnanas where if it was a strictly linear system, they would have no business being there at all. But there they are, what to do.
Yeah. I have to say, I've actually not heard that idea articulated before of dukkha as your actual personal experience of unsatisfactoriness, of just sort of this sucks, versus dukkha as the universal, as the characteristic, and drawing a distinction between those two things. And that actually, once you, through seeing clearly, especially through seeing not self, and through seeing impermanence, your personal dukkha is maybe not there in the same way. It creates a relationship with the universal characteristic of dukkha that's not intrinsically a painful relationship. It's sort of a relationship of understanding and a sort of almost nonchalant acceptance of that which is simply the case.
But you notice that it does have the heart connection. You know, like with anicca, impermanence, change, the perception of it is predominantly cognitive. Oh, I can see things are changing.
Yeah.
When you get into dukkha, the perception is heart. It's affective. It's the affective relationship. That's where you enter into the realm of tanha, craving, drivenness, upadana, appropriation, clinging, and not self kind of brings them together. So the way that the insight develops is both head and heart. and a lot of the purification of the heart takes place with the dukkha jnana.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Not always fun. Very valuable though.
It's where it's when the tears come that you know you're getting deep.
Yeah. Ugh, that hits. All right. Well, the timing could not be more perfect. We are right at the hour mark. I do have one short sort of functional question for you, Patrick, which I forgot to ask you earlier, but I mean to ask every teacher who comes and joins us. I sometimes forget. Do you take one-on-one students? Do you do one-on-one interactions, whether it's via Zoom or some other way? Do you work with people one-on-one as a teacher?
Yeah, via Zoom. Usually people that I've worked with in a retreat situation.
Okay. So you generally won't take sort of new students if you haven't done retreat with them. It doesn't sound like it's a hard and fast rule, but that sounds like the tendency.
Yeah, it's not hard and fast, but that's often the way.
Uh-huh. And do you do that how does that work? Do you do Dana? Do you do a different method? What's your approach?
I operate on Dana.
Mm-hmm. In other words, what someone in the spirit of generosity and gratitude wants to offer, that's how that's handled.
Yeah, there's no charge. You cannot charge for Dharma because you can't buy it and you can't sell it.
Well said. Okay. So yeah, I'm putting together a list of teachers that we have spoken with here at Sitheads that are sort of friends of the group that do take one-on-one students. And we like to mention if it's fee-based, if it's Dana-based. Would you object to being added to that short spreadsheet of?
No, put me on. We'll see what happens.
All right.
I have to warn you that I'm incredibly disorganized. It can take a while for me to figure out, especially across time zones. Oh my God.
Yeah, fair enough. Good. So someone will have to climb a little bit of a mountaintop if they want to get the teachings for once. The mountaintop of your disorganization.
I need a manager.
So maybe that could be someone's Dana. Maybe they can be your assistant. So that brings us to the end of our talk. I enjoyed this so much, Patrick, and I appreciate you very, very much for being here with us. Sit-heads.com is our website. PatrickKearney.net is Patrick's website. That's Patrick spelled the normal way, Patrick. Kearney spelled in a way that you might not expect. Kearney, PatrickKearney.net. That's where you can find Patrick. Patrick, any final things you want to say before we close for the evening or morning, as the case may be for you?
Just to thank you for the invitation, and it's been fun to meet you. And if you want to do a retreat, I do Zoom retreats.
Hey, okay. Is that the
I might be
information for that?
disorganized,
I
but
presume is on the website.
Yep, it's on the website. There's one in May. Next one will be in October, I think, thereabouts.
Okay. Cool. So definitely check out Patrick's website to see what he's got going on in terms of retreats. And if you want to try and sneak in one-on-one lesson or interview, sounds like he's open to that. Patrick,
there's on the website, on the front page, is a contact form. You can send off an email.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for being here, Patrick. And to everyone who is here with us, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your practice. And I hope you all have a wonderful night. Bye, everybody. Take care.
Thank you very much.